You are not born knowing how to raise a child. No human is. But for roughly 300,000 years, your ancestors didn't need a book, a pediatrician, or a parenting philosophy to figure it out. They had something else entirely. They had everyone. This is the story of how ancient humans actually raised their children. And almost none of it looks like what you do today. The moment a child was born into a hunter-gatherer band, something happened that no modern hospital room replicates. The infant didn't go to a crib. It didn't go to a separate room. It went to a body, skin against skin, heartbeat against heartbeat. That physical contact wasn't a choice, it was the default. Among the Ipo people of Papua New Guinea, documented by researcher Wolf Schiefenhovel, infants were held or carried in near-constant physical contact with a caregiver for the first years of life. Not occasionally, constantly. Your ancestors didn't have strollers. They had arms. And those arms belonged to more than just one person. This is the first thing that would shock you about ancient childhood. The mother was not doing this alone. Not even close. Evolutionary anthropologist Sarah Blaffer HRDY spent decades studying what she calls cooperative breeding, the idea that humans evolved to raise children collectively, not in isolated nuclear units. In her 2009 work Mothers and Others, HRDY argues that this wasn't a cultural preference. It was a biological adaptation. Human infants are the most dependent, slowest developing offspring of any primate on Earth. A single mother, hunting and foraging to survive, could not physically carry, feed, and protect a helpless infant alone for years at a time. Evolution solved this problem not by making infants more independent, but by making the group responsible. The word for this is alloparenting. It simply means others parent too. Aunts, older siblings, friends, and neighbors all held, fed, soothed, and watched over infants that weren't biologically theirs. The child didn't belong to a mother and a father. The child belonged to the band. And what about the fathers? Here is where the data surprises most people. Among the Aka Pygmies of Central Africa, anthropologist Barry Hewlett found something that no other recorded society has matched. AKA fathers held their infants more than any other group of fathers ever documented skin to skin, for hours each day, while the mother foraged or rested. Hewlett's 1991 study, Intimate Fathers, demolished the assumption that prehistoric fathers were distant providers. In small mobile bands where survival required cooperation, fathers were present. Physically present. Tenderly present. Your ancient father probably knew exactly what you smelled like. Now imagine the child is 2 years old, maybe 3. In the modern world, weaning has likely happened. The child sleeps in a separate room. Daycare may have already begun. But in the ancestral world, that child is still nursing. Richard Lee's landmark research on the Kung San people of the Kalahari, published in 1979, found that children were breastfed on demand for 3 to 4 years on average. This wasn't just nutrition. Extended nursing suppressed ovulation, naturally spacing births roughly 4 years apart. Your ancient mother's body used breastfeeding as a form of family planning, written into her biology long before the concept existed. And at night, the child slept next to its mother, next to its father, sometimes next to half the band. Co-sleeping wasn't a parenting trend. It was the only option that made sense when predators moved in the dark and warmth was survival. So when did ancient children learn anything? This is where the picture gets even more interesting. They didn't sit in rows. Nobody lectured them. Nobody handed them a curriculum. Anthropologist David Lancy, in his 2015 cross-cultural survey, The Anthropology of Childhood, describes a model he calls Lopi learning by observing and pitching in. Ancient children learned by watching adults work and then joining in when they were ready. A child of 5 watched a grandmother skin an animal. A child of 6 tried to help carry water. By the time a hunter-gatherer child was 10 or 11, they were genuinely useful members of the group, not because they were forced into labor, but because participation was the only game in town. Nicholas Blurton-Jones, studying the Hadza of Tanzania, found that children as young as 4 or 5 were already gathering berries and tubers, contributing real calories to the group. They weren't playing at adulthood. They were practicing it, surrounded by peers of different ages who taught them through doing, failing, and trying again. And that peer group mattered enormously. Ancient children spent most of their waking hours not with adults but in mixed-age playgroups, older children modeling skills for younger ones, hierarchies forming and dissolving, social rules being negotiated without a referee. Melvin Konner's sweeping 2010 synthesis, The Evolution of Childhood, found that physical punishment of children was rare in forager societies. Conflict was diffused. Children were given extraordinary freedom to roam, explore, and make mistakes within the safety of a group that collectively watched over them. The village wasn't a metaphor. It was a survival strategy. But there is one figure in ancient childhood who deserves special attention. One figure who, the data suggests, may have changed the entire trajectory of human evolution. Not the mother, not the father, the grandmother. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues proposed something radical in a 1998 paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They called it the grandmother hypothesis. The idea is this: human females live far longer after menopause than any other primate. That post-reproductive lifespan, sometimes 20 or 30 years, isn't an accident of medicine. It evolved. Why? Because grandmothers who stopped reproducing and instead invested their energy in grandchildren dramatically increased those grandchildren's chances of survival. A grandmother who dug tubers, carried water, and watched over toddlers freed her daughter to have another child sooner. The survival math worked. Evolution selected for grandmothers who stuck around and helped. Rebecca Sear and Ruth Mace confirmed this in a 2008 review published in Evolution and Human Behavior, analyzing child survival data across dozens of traditional societies. The presence of a maternal grandmother was one of the single strongest predictors of whether a child survived its early years. Not wealth, not the father's status. The grandmother. Your ancient grandmother may have been the most important person in your life, and she knew it. At night, when the fire burned low, the teaching didn't stop. Polly Wiesner spent years recording fireside conversations among the Jew/Hoansi Bushmen of the Kalahari. In a 2014 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, she found that roughly 80% of nighttime conversations around the fire involved storytelling. Not logistics, not food planning. Stories. Myths, moral tales, accounts of distant relatives, explanations of why the world worked the way it did. Ancient children didn't read before bed. They listened. And through those stories, they absorbed everything their culture knew about how to be human. Your first education happened in firelight. Now think about what you've built around childhood today. Separate bedrooms, scheduled playdates, standardized curricula, pediatric specialists, parenting philosophies that contradict each other in back-to-back bestsellers. The nuclear family, two adults largely alone, responsible for producing and shaping an entire human being from scratch. It is, by the standards of 300,000 years of human history, an extraordinarily recent experiment. And an extraordinarily isolating one. The ancient child didn't have a bedroom, but it had a grandmother who would die for it. It had a father who held it against his skin. It had a band of aunts and cousins and older children who watched over it every waking hour. It had fireside stories that explained the universe. It had freedom to roam and fail and learn within a web of relationships so dense that the question of who was responsible for this child had only one answer. Everyone. That answer hasn't changed in your biology. Only in your circumstances. You didn't come from a nuclear family. You came from a band. And somewhere in you, that child who belonged to everyone is still listening for the fire.